He was 19 years old, a brilliant physicist at America's most secret laboratory, and he made a decision that would haunt him for 50 years. In October 1944, Ted Hall stood inside Los Alamos, surrounded by the minds building the world's first atomic bomb. But while his colleagues debated science, Hall asked a different question. What happens when only one nation holds the power to end civilization? 3 weeks later, in a cramped New York apartment, he handed the Soviets the blueprints to the plutonium bomb. Not for money, not under threat, but because he believed, truly believed, he was preventing World War III. The FBI suspected. They interrogated him twice, but they could never prove it. And for half a century, Ted Hall lived with a secret that consumed him from the inside. Because the bomb he helped build detonated in Kazakhstan in 1949. And the arms race he tried to prevent? It happened anyway. Tens of thousands of warheads, decades of terror, children taught to hide under desks. He thought he was saving humanity. But what if he'd only accelerated its potential destruction? Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love hearing from history lovers around the world. And if you're here for the hidden truths behind the Cold War, the declassified stories they don't teach in textbooks, subscribe now. Every day I bring you the moral dilemmas, the impossible choices, and the secrets that shape the most dangerous era in human history. Now, let's go. The desert wind carried dust across the plateau that October morning in 1944. Los Alamos, New Mexico, a place that didn't officially exist. No road signs pointed to it, no maps acknowledged it. Just a collection of hastily built wooden barracks perched on a mesa, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards who asked no questions and gave no answers. Inside those barracks, the greatest minds in physics were racing against time. Einstein's equation had become a blueprint. Theory was becoming terrible reality. And among the Nobel laureates, the seasoned professors, the veteran scientists who'd fled fascism across Europe, there was Ted Hall. 19 years old, the youngest physicist on the Manhattan Project. He'd arrived that spring, fresh from Harvard, barely old enough to vote, but brilliant enough to be assigned to the implosion group, the heart of the plutonium bomb design. While other teenagers his age were storming beaches in Normandy or Ireland, hopping across the Pacific, Hall was solving equations that would reshape human history. He worked 18-hour days, filling blackboards with calculations, attending briefings where men spoke casually about yields and blast radiuses and acceptable casualties. At night, in his barracks bunk, Hall couldn't sleep. Not because of the work. The physics thrilled him. It was the purest intellectual challenge imaginable. No, what kept him awake was a question nobody else seemed to be asking. What happens after? What happens when America alone possesses a weapon that can vaporize cities? What happens when one nation holds a monopoly on apocalypse? Hall had grown up reading history. He understood power. He'd watched from across the ocean as fascism consumed Europe, as dictators promised peace and delivered genocide. And now, as he lay in the darkness, listening to coyotes howl across the New Mexico desert, he wondered, was America different? Could any nation be trusted with absolute power? The question consumed him. During lunch breaks, while his colleagues discussed baseball or complained about the food, Hall sat alone, wrestling with moral calculations more complex than any physics problem. He believed in democracy. He believed America was fighting a just war. But he also believed, deeply, urgently, that monopoly bred tyranny. That balance, however dangerous, was safer than domination. By summer's end, he'd made his decision. Not rashly, not under pressure, with the cold logic of a physicist examining variables. If only America had the bomb, they might use it again. And again. They might dictate terms to the entire world. The Soviet Union, for all its brutality under Stalin, would have no choice but to submit or face annihilation. But if both sides had the bomb, then mutual fear would prevent mutual destruction. Balance of terror instead of monopoly of power. It seemed to his 19-year-old mind like the only rational solution. What Hall didn't consider, what he couldn't see from inside his brilliant, isolated logic, was that he was about to set in motion consequences he couldn't control, that he was accelerating history in ways that would haunt him until his final breath. In early October 1944, Hall requested leave to visit New York. His supervisors approved without question. The young physicist had earned a break. What they didn't know was that Hall's Harvard roommate, Saville Sachs, had maintained contact with certain circles in New York, circles connected to Soviet intelligence. The train ride east took 3 days. Hall spent them rehearsing what he would say, how he would say it, convincing himself over and over that this was right. Moral. Necessary. He wasn't betraying his country. He was saving civilization. The handoff happened in a Queens apartment on a gray afternoon. No dramatic spycraft. No dead drops or coded messages. Just two terrified young men, Hall and Sachs, sitting across from a Soviet contact who seemed almost as nervous as they were. Hall had prepared pages of notes, technical details about the implosion design, the configuration of explosive lenses, the critical mass calculations, information that had cost billions of dollars and represented years of theoretical work by the greatest minds in physics. He handed it over. His hands shook slightly, but his voice remained steady. "The world can't afford an American monopoly," he said. "This is necessary." The Soviet agent took the papers, asked a few questions to verify Hall understood what he was giving them, then left. The entire meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. 30 minutes that would echo across the next 50 years. 30 minutes that would help build tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, fuel a Cold War that brought humanity to the brink of extinction multiple times, and create generations who grew up believing they might not live to adulthood. But sitting in that Queens apartment, watching autumn rain streak the windows, Ted Hall felt only relief. He'd done it. He'd prevented monopoly. He'd saved the world. He returned to Los Alamos a week later, his secret buried deep, his conscience apparently clear. He went back to work as though nothing had changed. The calculations continued. The bomb design progressed. And in the pre-dawn darkness of July 16, 1945, Hall stood in the New Mexico desert alongside his colleagues and watched the Trinity test light up the sky like a second sun. Robert Oppenheimer whispered words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." Ted Hall said nothing, but inside he thought, "At least now both sides will have death. At least now fear will keep the peace." He was about to learn that fear doesn't keep peace. It only makes the inevitable catastrophe worse. The war ended. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki announced America's atomic monopoly to the world. Newspaper headlines screamed triumph. Political cartoons showed Uncle Sam wielding lightning bolts. President Truman declared a new era of American supremacy. The future, it seemed, belonged to whoever controlled the atom. Ted Hall returned to civilian life and tried to disappear into normalcy. He enrolled at the University of Chicago to continue his graduate work in physics. He attended seminars, published papers on crystallography, dated a young woman named Joan. To everyone who knew him, he was just another brilliant young scientist building a career in the post-war boom. But inside, Hall carried a weight that grew heavier with each passing month. He read every article about atomic policy, every debate about international control, every proposal for sharing nuclear secrets with the United Nations. When Bernard Baruch presented America's plan for atomic oversight, a plan that would have maintained American monopoly for years, Hall told himself he'd been right. His decision had been justified, necessary. Yet sleep became difficult. He'd wake at 3 in the morning, sweating, replaying that October afternoon in Queens. Had he given them enough? Too much? Would it actually work? Or had he simply committed treason for nothing? The Soviet contact reached out twice more in 1945, requesting updates, clarifications on technical details. Hall provided what he could, though he was no longer inside Los Alamos, and his access to classified information had evaporated. By early 1946, the contact stopped coming. Hall hoped they had what they needed. He met Joan Krakover that spring. She was smart, beautiful, studying Russian literature at Chicago. She made him laugh. She didn't ask too many questions about his war work. Everyone understood Los Alamos scientists didn't talk about Los Alamos. The secrecy was expected, even attractive, the mystique of men who'd touched history. They married in 1947. Hall was 22 years old, building a life that looked perfectly ordinary from the outside. He'd compartmentalized his secret so completely that even Joan, sleeping beside him every night, sensed nothing. Or perhaps she sensed something but didn't know how to name it. The occasional nightmare, the way his hands trembled when news reports mentioned Soviet nuclear research, the intensity with which he followed every congressional hearing about atomic espionage. Because by 1948, America was beginning to realize that secrets had leaked. Klaus Fuchs, the British physicist who'd also worked at Los Alamos, was under suspicion in London. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was convinced Soviet spies had penetrated the Manhattan Project. Investigations began quietly, methodically, reviewing personnel files, tracking associations, looking for the cracks in security that everyone knew must have existed. Hall's name never came up. He'd been so young, so junior, so seemingly harmless. The FBI focused on senior scientists, known communists, anyone with obvious Soviet sympathies. Hall had never joined the Communist Party. He'd kept his political views moderate, careful. His youthful idealism was invisible to investigators looking for hardened agents. So he continued teaching, researching, publishing. He and Joan had their first child. Hall played with his daughter in the evenings, read her bedtime stories, and wondered what kind of world she would inherit. Would it be the balanced, peaceful world he'd tried to create? Or something darker? The answer came on September 23, 1949. Hall was having coffee in the University Commons when someone turned up the radio. President Truman's voice filled the room. "We have evidence that within recent weeks, an atomic explosion occurred in the USSR." The room erupted in shock. Colleagues dropped their newspapers. Students whispered in disbelief. The Soviet Union had the bomb, years ahead of American predictions. The monopoly was over. Ted Hall sat very still, the coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd done it. He'd succeeded. The balance of power he'd dreamed of was now reality. So why did he suddenly feel like he'd made the most catastrophic mistake of his life? The knock came at dawn. February 1950. 2 FBI agents standing on Hall's doorstep, their faces professionally blank, their credentials gleaming in the winter morning light. "Dr. Hall, we'd like to ask you some questions about your time at Los Alamos." Joan stood behind him in her bathrobe, their daughter still sleeping upstairs. Hall's heart hammered in his chest, but his voice remained steady. Years of carrying the secret had taught him control. Of course, happy to help. They sat in the living room. Joan brought coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she poured. The agents asked routine questions at first. "Who did you work with? What was your security clearance? Did you notice anything unusual?" Hall answered carefully, precisely, giving them nothing they couldn't already know from official records. Then the shift. "Did you ever have contact with Soviet representatives during the war?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Completely certain." Oh, the lie came easily. Too easily. Hall had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. He knew exactly how to sound surprised, cooperative, even slightly offended by the implication. The agents watched him closely, looking for micro-expressions, hesitations, the tiny betrayals that separate truth from deception. They found nothing. After 2 hours, they thanked him and left. Joan stood at the window, watching their car disappear down the street. "Ted, what was that about?" "Security review. They're interviewing everyone from Los Alamos. Klaus Fuchs confessed in London last month. They're paranoid now, checking everyone. It wasn't entirely a lie. Klaus Fuchs had indeed confessed, a German-born physicist who'd passed far more information than Hall ever had. But Fuchs's arrest had triggered something Hall hadn't anticipated: a complete review of Los Alamos security. Every scientist, every technician, every person who'd had access to classified information was now suspect. What Hall didn't know, couldn't know, was that American codebreakers had been quietly decrypting Soviet intelligence cables since 1943. The Venona project, so secret that even President Truman wasn't fully briefed, had identified dozens of Soviet agents operating in America. And buried in those cables were references to someone codenamed M-Lad, Russian for young. The FBI had narrowed it down. M-Lad was a physicist. M-Lad had access to implosion design data. M-Lad was young, possibly the youngest at Los Alamos. The profile fit Ted Hall almost perfectly. But profiles aren't proof. The Venona decrypts couldn't be used in court without exposing the entire operation. So the FBI watched and waited, hoping Hall would make a mistake, contact his handlers, do something that would give them prosecutable evidence. Hall felt the surveillance, or thought he did. Cars that seemed to follow him, the same face in different coffee shops, his mail arriving slightly disturbed, as though someone had opened and resealed it. He said nothing to Joan. What could he say? He threw himself into his work, publishing papers on solid-state physics, avoiding anything related to weapons or nuclear research. His friend Saville Sachs wasn't handling it as well. Sachs had served as courier, the go-between in those early contacts. Now he was drinking heavily, seeing threats everywhere. He called Hall late one night, drunk and terrified. "They know. They have to know. We should just confess, get ahead of it." "There's nothing to confess," Hall said coldly. "You're paranoid. Get some sleep." He hung up and sat in the darkness of his study, surrounded by physics journals and family photographs. His daughter's artwork was taped to the wall, crayon drawings of houses and sunshine and stick-figure families. Normal life, safe life, but underneath it all, the secret pulsed like a second heartbeat. The bomb he'd helped build had detonated exactly as designed. Soviet nuclear tests continued. The arms race was accelerating, and Ted Hall, sitting alone in suburban Chicago, realized he couldn't undo what he'd done. He could only wait to see if he'd be caught. The second interview came in March 1951. Same agents, different approach. This time, they brought photographs, grainy surveillance images of people Hall had never seen before. Or had he? They watched his face as he studied each one, searching for recognition, for the flicker of memory that would confirm their suspicions. "Do you recognize any of these individuals?" Hall examined each photograph carefully, his physicist's mind cataloging details while his survival instinct screamed warnings. "No, should I? We have reason to believe some of these people were Soviet intelligence officers operating in New York during the war. I was rarely in New York during the war, but you did visit. October 1944. Your leave records show a week in New York City." Hall's pulse quickened, but his expression remained neutral. "I visited my family. My roommate Saville Sachs. It was a break from Los Alamos. We went to museums, saw some shows." The agents let silence fill the room, an interrogation technique designed to make suspects uncomfortable, to provoke them into filling the void with confessions. Hall had read about this. He waited them out, patient as a chess player studying the board. Finally, they stood. "If you remember anything, Dr. Hall, anything at all, contact us immediately." They left their card. Hall burned it that evening, watching the paper curl and blacken in the kitchen sink. Joan didn't ask why. She'd learned not to ask certain questions. Their marriage had developed a careful geography, safe topics and dangerous silences, areas where conversation flowed freely, and borders that remained unspoken but absolute. The years passed like a held breath. The Rosenbergs were arrested in 1950, tried in 1951, executed in 1953. Hall read every article about their case, saw the photographs of their two young sons left orphaned, and felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. That could have been him. That could have been Joan and their children. But it wasn't. The FBI's evidence against the Rosenbergs was strong. Testimony, documents, a clear chain of contacts. Against Hall, they had only suspicions and undecipherable code names in Soviet cables they couldn't publicly acknowledge. So they watched and he waited, both sides locked in a silent stalemate that would last decades. Hall left America in 1962. He accepted a research position at Cambridge University in England, ostensibly for career advancement, but really to escape the surveillance he could never quite prove but always felt. Joan and the children came with him. They built a new life in the green quiet of English academia, far from FBI scrutiny, far from the desert where it had all begun. Cambridge welcomed him. He became a respected researcher in biophysics, publishing groundbreaking work on X-ray crystallography. Students knew him as brilliant but reserved, a gentle professor who never discussed his past. Colleagues assumed his reticence was simply British academic propriety. No one suspected the Los Alamos physicist, who'd once calculated blast radiuses, now spent his evenings measuring the structure of organic molecules. But history doesn't forget. In 1995, after the Soviet Union collapsed and archives began opening, American intelligence declassified the Venona transcripts. Journalists and historians pored over the decoded cables, matching code names to real identities. And there it was, Malad, Theodore Alvin Hall, the youngest Los Alamos spy, the one who got away. Reporter Joseph Albright tracked him down in Cambridge. Hall was 70 years old now, diagnosed with terminal kidney cancer. He had nothing left to lose. Nothing except perhaps the last chance to explain himself, to make someone understand why a brilliant 19-year-old had made a choice that would haunt him for half a century. He agreed to talk, not to confess. He still refused to use that word, but to explain, to finally tell the truth he'd carried in silence for 50 years. What he said would change nothing, but perhaps, in the end, being understood mattered more than being forgiven. The interview took place in Hall's Cambridge home, autumn light filtering through windows overlooking a garden he'd tended for 30 years. His hands, once steady enough to solve equations that split atoms, now trembled with illness. But his mind remained sharp, his memory precise, his need to explain overwhelming. "I was convinced," he told Albright, his voice carrying the weight of decades, "that an American monopoly was dangerous, more dangerous than sharing the information. I thought I was preventing a nuclear dictatorship." Albright asked the question everyone wanted answered. "Do you regret it?" Hall was silent for a long moment. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the world became what it did. But do I regret trying to prevent monopoly? I don't know anymore. The calculus seemed clear when I was 19. Now, at 70, I'm not sure I understood anything." The arms race he'd tried to prevent had happened anyway, worse than he'd imagined. Not just 2 bombs, but tens of thousands. Not just America and the Soviet Union, but Britain, France, China, others to come. The balance of terror he'd envisioned became something more terrifying. A doomsday clock perpetually hovering minutes from midnight, generations living under the shadow of annihilation. Cuba, 1962. The world came within hours of nuclear war. Hall, watching from Cambridge, realized that the Soviet missiles pointed at American cities used designs descended partly from information he'd provided. The cascade of consequences from that October afternoon in Queens had led directly to this, humanity's closest brush with self-extinction. Berlin, the Able Archer exercise that nearly triggered World War III. Countless close calls, false alarms, moments when computer errors or human judgment stood between civilization and apocalypse. Each incident added weight to Hall's conscience, another stone in a burden that grew heavier every year. Joan learned the truth only after the Venona revelations. 50 years of marriage, and she'd never known. The betrayal wasn't just of his country, It was of her, of their children, of every moment of intimacy built on a foundation of lies. She stayed with him through the final years, but something essential had broken. How do you reconcile the man you loved with the spy who deceived you for half a century? He wasn't evil, she told an interviewer years later after Hall's death. That's what makes it so difficult. He was gentle, brilliant, devoted to his work and family. But he'd made this catastrophic decision as a teenager and spent the rest of his life trying to convince himself it was right. I don't think he ever succeeded. Ted Hall died in November 1999 in a Cambridge hospice with Joan at his bedside. He was never prosecuted. The evidence was too old, too circumstantial, too entangled with intelligence methods the government wouldn't expose. He died legally innocent, historically guilty, morally ambiguous. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his contributions to crystallography and biophysics. It said nothing about Los Alamos, nothing about espionage, nothing about the bomb. To most of the world, he remained just another brilliant scientist who'd lived a quiet academic life. But buried in archives, in declassified files and decoded cables, his true legacy remained. The young physicist who thought he could see the future clearly, who believed his genius extended beyond physics into moral philosophy, who was convinced that balance of terror was safer than monopoly of power. He was wrong, or perhaps he was right in the wrong way. The monopoly would have been dangerous, but the alternative, the world he helped create, was simply dangerous differently. More weapons, more terror, more generations living with the certainty that humanity had built the means of its own extinction and placed those means in the hands of men as fallible as Ted Hall himself. In the end, his story isn't about espionage or ideology. It's about the danger of certainty, the risk of believing at 19 or 90 that we alone can see clearly when the rest of the world is blind.